Hi, and welcome to the fourth in our series on the Ukrainian war that has been taking place. Before we get started, let's go over the rules for those who may not be familiar. So this is not an academic presentation, nor is it, strictly speaking, a presentation. None of us are accredited in the various disciplines that we are discussing, although we have a lot of lay knowledge and a lot of knowledge that may come from similar disciplines that may be of use. Our presentation will come from a secular and hopefully non-biased perspective. In our group, we tend not to be terribly Russophilic, but at the same time, we do judge Ukraine quite harshly based on the issues that are going on in Ukraine. And so we feel that our perspective will be biased. The next thing is, of course, that this is a sensitive topic, so let's be respectful of the various opinions. And sorry. We love interactivity here, so please ask your questions, comments, and clarifications, put them in the chat. We do read the chat, and especially when we get to our question and answer period, which will happen after our short introduction, we will be talking and opining on your questions. So the more questions you have, the merrier. And to that point, this is going to be a short presentation. Probably the presentation will be about 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes, and then the discussion will come afterwards. And like the other three entrants in our Ukraine series, as well as all of the other series we do, like my Middle Eastern History series, Aaron's European Union Defense and Politics series, Zach's Rome series, these are all up on the website and you can watch them later. So we wanted to sort of we've talked about Ukrainian history up to the Soviet period before, and so we want to do a little bit of a deeper dive in the last 30 years, right? Ukraine has become independent. And similarly to what we've discussed before, there was this huge issue when the Soviet Union broke up, in that a lot of Russian military equipment was now in the territory of states not under Moscow's direct control, right? In particular, Ukraine had a significant amount of nuclear weapons, and they had nuclear weapons in the 5 cities you can see on the map in the lower left-hand side there. And those would be in silos, in mobile missile launchers, like you can see in the upper left-hand side. They had access to nuclear power in an offensive capability. And so there was a lot of negotiations between 1991, when Ukraine became independent, and 1994, when the Budapest Memorandum was signed, that led to Ukraine effectively becoming a nuclear-free state in an offensive capability, right? Ukraine still maintains a number of nuclear power plants. Zaporizhia, which we're probably going to be talking about, is the largest nuclear reactor on the European continent, and that's still in Ukraine. But from an offensive military standpoint, Ukraine decided to give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees from the West and from Russia. Aaron, would you like to comment a little bit on this?
Yeah, I mean, there is a pretty substantial treaty that basically Russia doesn't recognize, which was signed in '94, which in principle guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine and indefinitely was supposed to prevent any territorial incursion by anyone, but ideally, Russia. And that was in exchange for giving up, primarily giving up nuclear weapons, but also giving up any intercontinental launch capacity also. So it wasn't just the nuclear weapons, the actual warheads. It was actually the complete complex of conventional and non-conventional intercontinental capability. And so, I think it's pretty clear globally that, I think everybody's understood this for a long time, but I think this conflict makes it perfectly clear that if you have any intercontinental capability, much less a nuclear capacity, it would not serve your interest if you're a state to give those up under any circumstances going forward. So the whole disarmament, I mean, I personally think the whole disarmament regime in principle is done because of this. And you look at prior states that have, voluntarily given up either authorized or non-authorized or accepted non-proliferation agreements, whether Libya or Brazil or South Africa, et cetera. And as states like Japan and South Korea and others are likely building up those capacities, or on the on a turnkey switch where they can have them up in a matter of months or a year or two. I just don't think that you're going to want to give these up, and that's going to, I think, have a knock-on effect, obviously across the Middle East. But I think in but I think in East Asia, it's going to become much more intense, primarily because of the density of those states with modern technological capacity, between
right. Now, sort of a follow-up question to that, right? You have this situation where Russia is willing to concede to the territorial integrity, at least in name, in 1994. And then, of course, in 2014 and following in 2019 and 2022, Russia has shown that it is not interested in preserving the territorial integrity of Ukraine. What is the reason, in your view, for this change in policy? Or was the Russian policy in the beginning disingenuous to its true intent?
Well, I mean, I don't think, because obviously, you've obviously have had revanchists. You have revanchist thinkers in every large state on earth, but it's a question of, are they 1 or 2% of your population? Are they 1 or 2% of your political elites? Or are they 30, 40, 50, 60%? So I think Russia was focused on enough of their own challenges in the early to mid 90s that caring about the challenges of Ukraine, which was roughly a third almost of the size of the Russian population, they were glad not to have to try to manage Ukrainian economic and social and political challenges. So I think it was pretty forward and honest in relative terms. I do believe that when there was a transition between Yeltsin to Putin and then into what I think would call the more stable modern Russia, post Cold War, basically after 2000, after the Chechen War, and the consolidation of sort of political control in Russia. I think there was a new, I almost view this as it's like Russian version of neocon almost. It's like there's this Russian neoconservatism, which is sort of cherry picking a lot of pieces of imperial history, Soviet history, let's say postmodernism. I mean, it's sort of a grab bag, and it's mixed with opportunism. And so wherever anything is in the ex-Soviet sphere of influence, based on what the Russians feel opportunistic at that moment, they feel that they have the right to declare their own interest. It's almost a modern version. I think it's the closest analogy of the late 19th century U.S. Monroe Doctrine. Towards the Americas, towards South and Central and Latin America, and right, really not Mexico, because Mexico and the U.S. have always, in a weird way, Mexico and U.S. was for a long time very Ukraine, Russia like. So it was always a little different. That's what does make Ukraine, I think, a little different, is that the Monroe Doctrine versus Mexico was always a completely different special case because of the scale of Mexico, right? And, Mexico's a third of the population of the U.S. Ukraine's about a third of the population of Russia. And so, having the same policy about, Tajikistan, or the U.S. equivalent of Honduras, is different than a policy around Ukraine and Mexico. But they went to take a bite out of the whale.
Right.
And they kept biting.
Now, a question about the 1994 negotiations.
Yeah.
To what extent did Ukraine actually have leverage in those negotiations? Was Ukraine actually able to prevent itself from being nuclear disarmed? Or was this really an agreement between the US and Russia, similar to, like, for example, the Munich agreement in 1938, where Czechoslovakia had really no say in the negotiations between Nazi Germany and the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's sort of in the middle, right? It's not quite as extreme as Czechoslovakia, but Ukraine was not a peer party to this. This was ultimately a U.S. And the thing to recognize, this is 28 years ago, so you have to. Well, you don't have to do anything, but it's in the interest to understand this, to recognize what politics were in 1994 in terms of this idea of attempting to construct a post-Cold War peace dividend, this idea of, a little bit of the end of history optimism that, hey, if we could just get trade, can't we all just get along kind of politics. Trade, everyone can be a little weird, but as long as we were peaceful weird in our own sort of national way, it was okay. And, and to be honest, I think Russia was reasonably compliant in that. I think so was the US. We really, in the US, and I'd say most of the West, including almost all of NATO, was very focused on non-proliferation. And for the most part, that actually is a success that isn't really discussed. Is you look at peak nuclear capability and warheads and launch capacity, circa 1986, and then by 2001, those 15 years. I mean, you had a decline per year as a rolling average that was 3 or 4 times faster than the ramp up between, let's say, 55 and 70. So it was you could argue that was a success because we, especially amongst the two superpowers, that was a big deal. So I think Ukraine was inside that, and I don't believe they could have negotiated keeping any nuclear warheads. I do think they could have negotiated keeping, let's say, more regional and tactical ICBM launch capacity. I think that's one that they could have maintained, but they just, I think they felt they were getting rolled, to be very honest.
Yeah. So as we move forward out of the 90s, we move into the aughts, we see that there's a clear divide between Eastern and Western Ukraine in terms of their orientations, with Eastern Ukraine being more Russian oriented, with a larger number of Russian speakers and a larger percentage of Ukrainians wishing to be part of the Russian sphere of influence. And in the Western part, you can see more of Ukrainians wanting to seek a European direction, a Western direction in terms of their political policies. And this is really best described in the election between Viktor Yanukovych, who was a Russian puppet, and Viktor Yushchenko, who was more of a Ukrainian nationalist or Europeanist, perhaps we can say. And one of the things that I pointed out in several of the previous presentations, and I'll point again here, is that the borders between West Ukraine and East Ukraine seem to match to a certain degree the borders between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that's that blue area, and the Hetmanate, which is the sort of that hashed pink green area. Whereas the eastern parts of Ukraine seem to match more the Zaporozhye and Sich, which is that sort of orange outlined area, the Crimean Khanate, which is the purple area, which was the sort of the Burgundy area, and the Ottoman Empire, which is the purple area. So it's interesting that these areas historically end up lining up with politics in the early aughts. And this is a period where Viktor Yanukovych took power, but it was very clear that Viktor Yushchenko was definitely the winner in terms of votes, but the Russian consolidation and control of Ukraine was at a point where they could overturn the results of the 2004 election. Does anybody want to comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I personally think that the political side of the conflict begins here. I believe we have a little more of a revisionist history around the conflict sort of magically begins in 2014. I think the foundation of this was already beginning in 03, 02, 03, as the politics of Ukraine were starting to split, which you could argue is back to the original Polish-Lithuanian versus Russian, Little Russia, Greater Russia, White Russia, etc. In terms of history. And as you've pointed out before, these lines haven't moved much in, but 200 to 300 years. I mean, I do believe those lines have moved now. I really do. I think there is a substantial change in Ukrainian identity that this war is generating, or has generated, and will continue to generate. But I believe this conflict really, its genesis is back almost 20 years now. And I do think that's a mistake that we have in the West to try to attach it to the Russians just grabbing Crimea in 2014, because it reduces our culpability in the, let's call it, the early gaslighting phase of this, which was all political, which was not necessarily very violent. I mean, I'm sure there were small acts of violence, but in terms of it was a state level to state level conflict, and the political and cultural alliance regimes that we have allow an actor to basically arbitrage gaslighting like this, and Russia is, a preeminent, expert at this.
Now, Ralph, you'll have something you'd like to add?
Just a comment on this. I think the question of Russian orientation is a little bit of a tricky one, and I think this 2004 election map is a good one. I think it might be worth mentioning the 1991 referendum. When the Soviet Union broke up, Ukraine had a referendum on whether to become an independent country or remain with Russia. And the vote was 92% in favor of Ukrainian independence.
Yep.
And that included a majority of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers, as well as the vast majority of Ukrainian nationalists. So we might want to make a distinction between those who sort of have some sort of Russian orientation and those who really would prefer to be part of Russia. The one group is probably rather bigger than the other. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point.
Ralph, actually, to dig into that a little bit, why do you think there was such a distinction between, because in this election, it looks close to about 45-50% of the population wanted a Russian orientation. And you've mentioned that only 8% wanted to be under Russian direct control. Why do you think there's such a big gap between those numbers?
Well, I don't know. I don't know that I haven't seen an analysis of. My guess would be that Yanukovych was not calling for annexation. There's a difference between Russian orientation, being sort of wanting friendly relations with Russia on the one hand, and wanting to become part of Russia. So I'm saying, yes, there are rather more people in the East who want to be close, want to have close connections with Russia, but would nonetheless prefer to be an independent Ukrainian state. Thanks.
Yeah. Mark, you wanted to add something as well.
Yeah, there was just a quick point in that the definition of, I'm sorry, I stopped you. The definition of what it is to be Ukrainian is somewhat nebulous, and it can include Ukrainian speakers, and it can include Russian speakers. So there are lots of Russian speakers who don't even speak Ukrainian, who consider themselves Ukrainian, who don't want to necessarily be part of Russia. So it's that there's that also that in the mix. And also the people in the East now that have suffered Russian bombardment, they're that much more Ukrainian now than before the war.
So do you think it's simply the fact that they've been in war that makes them feel a connection to the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian society? Or do you think that there's something about living on the land or some other kind of connection to historic Ukrainian culture that makes them feel Ukrainian, even though they're Russian speakers?
Yeah, I think it's just the definition of what it is to be Ukrainian. I think it's they've lived in this province, and it's also how they got there. A lot of the people in the East were, for a lack of a better word, colonists from Russia proper, where they would set up mines and factories and things like that, and then they would import Russians from Russia proper into this area. So it's a good question. I'd like to know more about it, but it has to do with identifying with the surrounding the surrounding populace, I guess.
Yeah, and I do think there's a historiography to this, and I even have some of that experience on my mother's side. So my grandfather was born in Odessa, and he always identified himself as Russian. But then over generations, people would identify themselves as Ukrainian. And as a kid or whatever, I mean, I never really connected those dots, to be honest. It was just sort of like, I think that whole, oh yeah, Russia, Ukraine, whatever, it's all, the same. But I can see sort of how that interspersing of life and identity was defining itself over really the generations of the 20th century, because, he came over here in like he was born in 1903, but came over here, I think, around 1910, 1908, during all the purges, pogroms, everything else. So, that definition of what it was to be Russian is almost, in a weird way, calling itself like Western, but in a Russian orientation, right? It's this idea that Russia was such a dominant thing in societies across all those regions, but then you had your own localized identity, and I think that obviously in the modern world that's changed pretty substantially, because the construction of Ukrainian identity is something that is real in the last 60, 70 years.
And just as a final point to your question, Richard, about the identity, it's what's also happened at this, during this war, is that a lot of even the Russians, the Russian-speaking Ukrainians, are calling the Russians Muscovites. That's their word for those Russians that we hate now.
Exactly.
Let me just add one thing very quickly. So this stems back to earlier time, during Khrushchev time and Brezhnev. There was a lot of nationalist drive. For example, I'm from one of the republics, which is Uzbekistan, and we had this president in Uzbekistan, or a communist leader of Uzbekistan party. His name was Sharaf Rashidov, and he basically declared that we would like to have nationalistic universities. There was parallel schools that were only in Uzbek language. The same was happening in Ukraine, Moldova, to kind of identify the identity. Prior to that, especially after World War II, Stalin kind of suppressed all that. Remember, deportation of Tatars, deportation of Chechens, deportation of Koreans, and all of this nationalistic moves were suppressed because he just wanted to have one Soviet Union citizen. And during Brezhnev and Khrushchev, as it was coming back to a more nationalistic stage, this was setting up the stage to 1991 break up Soviet Union, and everybody kind of agreed, through the Belarusian Accord to break up, basically. And 1993 putsch was not actually any factor at all. That's just my 2 cents. Thank you, guys.
So if we move forward a little bit to 2014, we had what was called the Euromaidan Revolution. And in our third episode in this series, Greg gave a very detailed account of the Euromaidan Revolution. But in simplest terms, it was a revolution against Viktor Yanukovych, who was that Russian-oriented individual, after he'd suppressed the results of an election that had brought to power more Western and more European-oriented elements in the Ukrainian government. And so you had a protest in Maidan Square in Kiev, which was attacked by the government with weapons. Many people died. There were medical facilities in the protest area. And accordingly, because of the survival of the protest, effectively Ukraine was able to have its first free and fair elections in which Petro Poroshenko, who was more Western aligned than Yanukovych had been, came to power. And does anybody want to make any quick comments on Euromaidan before we move into more recent events?
Well, there was that deal that Putin gave them a lot of money to renege on the association agreement with the EU.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think it's
That's what sparked it.
yeah. I do think 2014 is this continuation of the political side of the conflict from the early 2000s, and really this building up, that in essence, the orientation, this debate around orientation in Ukraine about either being neutral, or let's call it neutral plus Russia, or neutral plus Europe, or pro-Russia or pro-Europe, right? So those are like if in the spectrum, those are the four. And that ultimately tipping the balance to be, at worst case for Russia, neutral plus Russia was the worst case scenario, or being completely pro-Russian. That has been, in essence, the political proxy war for the last 20 years. And that's ultimately, I believe, one of the largest components, if not the largest component of the whole conflict itself, is that, and I think the NATO part of that, I've ultimately felt is secondary, because I think NATO is a byproduct of doing that. So if you become a full European orientation, you're ultimately going to be a part and party to those security arrangements. Whether they take you 30 years to get there or not, you're going to eventually get there. And losing Ukraine as both buffer, as a large state, and the larger sort of Russian identity, all those things, losing them to a full Europeanification is almost, it's a greater version of losing Poland in the, in the end of the Soviet Union. From a Russian, if you're a Russian nationalist, imperialist, sort of Sovietist, the grab bag, neocon, Russian neocon, then that's the equivalent of what losing Ukraine is. And I believe though losing Poland was a big deal. Actually, it's something that I don't think is significantly discussed.
Now, we've discussed in the previous three episodes the way that the troops moved. So this was the movement from the 5th of March, and you can see at that point the concentration on attacking Kiev, which is in that upper central area in the map. You can also see the attacks from Crimea to try and secure the Dnieper River. And we can see the attacks on the city of Kharkiv, which is towards the northeast of Ukraine. Then you switch to the 27th of March, and you can see how these intensified and how the Russians were able to acquire more ground than they had on at the beginning of the war. But by the 8th of May, which was our third session, we can see that the Ukrainians were able to push the Russians out of the areas around Kiev and the areas around the Dnieper River. The Russians argued that they were doing strategic redeployment. And so that's the reason that the Ukrainians were able to make these gains. But at the same time, you can see a lot of Russian movement concentrating in the east of Ukraine. And if you notice, when we go to the most recent map from 26th of June, very few things have changed in terms of this map. The arrows, of course, have become more intensified on the Russian side, and there are attempts now to bombard Kiev. I'm actually going to ask a little bit about that later. But by and large, over the last 2 months, the lines between the two sides have become relatively stable. Why is this part of the war so much less active on sort of a large sweeping ground level than it was in the earlier stages of the war?
I mean, I think we're in this phase after 4 months of some of the most intensive fighting, large scale fighting in the last 20 years anywhere in the world, that the first tier forces on both sides have reached, generally speaking, attrition and exhaustion. I believe they're both the first tier forces on both sides are somewhere 60 to 80% exhausted and attritioned, and that now we're in this battle of second and third tier forces on both sides, and then the significant loss, both in and on the Ukrainian side, of substantial amount of mechanized equipment. The Russians losing a decent amount of that, but their issue was never enough equipment. Their issue was enough infantry, because they have equipment, they have material, they have 40 years of material, but they don't have 40 years worth of infantry. But the highest trained quality forces that the Russians had, they had substantial losses in those. So we're in this, and the reason this is important is that what makes someone a second and third tier force or part of forces is the fact that they have very limited training, and that they're training, generally speaking, on fixed fortification battlefields. So it's actually the worst training you could have. It's not teaching you maneuver warfare. And so, to have gains, you need maneuver. And if you are struggling for trained, effective maneuver forces, and you don't have them, and you aren't partitioning them, right? You're not figuring out how to split them so that you can have one group training for 3 months and then rotate in. And both sides, I don't think, are doing a great job with that. I think a lot of it is neither side wants to give up territory to have a major counteroffensive at a later date, right? Which has been my argument for the Ukrainians for several months now, is they need to be willing, and this is easy for us to say in the West, because who's willing to give up Birmingham or Manchester or whatever? But the point is that they need to be willing to give up some of this area defense they have so that they can reconstitute forces and build a higher density of forces, right? So right now the forces are very small, company, battalion level. Maybe they're aggregating around brigades, but the brigades aren't maneuver, right? So it's a brigade that acts as sort of like a division or a corps. It doesn't really move. And so until either the Ukrainians or the Russians can generate larger density of forces that are maneuver oriented, you're really not going to move a lot on this battlefield until one side or another decides to shift their balance for a reason, to reconstitute forces, etc.
Now, one thing I wanted to ask while we had this map open, if we look, we can see between Ukraine and Moldova, there's that occupied region that's sort of in that light purple there, that's called Transnistria. Now, Transnistria has a number of Russian soldiers in it, and that's been the primary defense force of Transnistria. So why have we not seen, for example, them try to effect the pincer attack in Ukraine to try and unite that southern border? Or conversely, why have we not seen the Ukrainians try to attack Transnistria to remove that Russian presence from a possible pincer?
Because they both don't have the capabilities. I mean, the forces there, anybody that was worthy of actual fighting capacity in Transnistria for the Russians that could form these sort of composite BTGs, these battalion tactical groups, was cannibalized and stripped out. If those forces left, they would have a free run until they ran into enough mobile defense Ukrainian forces, and then they would get smoked. I mean, and that would be that. So, they just aren't capable. Right. And this is the issue right now that both sides have, is the maps are real, but the composition of the forces, when you see the little boxes out there with X's in them and zeros and all that stuff, I mean, the composition of those forces, if you were attempting to do a training center evaluation of them, those effectiveness of those forces are 5, 10, 20%, which is enough to have a fixed fortification defense, right? Because you don't need a world-class force to have fixed fortification defense, but you need a pretty high standards forces to start having mobile and maneuver forces, that are linking up, taking territory, switching, controlling while another one's attacking, et cetera. Think of it as like playing chess or checkers, right? Like when you're playing fast checkers in a park, or you see people doing that, you have to have a lot of mental acuity to be able to put all that together. And that's a limitation that both sides have right now. And I don't see that changing. The Russians, right now, they're doing this shadow mobilization, which is sort of scraping the barrel for anybody with prior service combat capability, 50 or under.
Yeah. So Mark, you also wanted to mention something.
Yeah, I wanted to connect with what Aaron was saying, that there's that shadow of mobilization is what they're doing is that they're pressuring a lot of people who are in the army to volunteer. And what they'll do is they'll put them on maneuvers. They'll keep them outside without boots on, all sorts of things. But they can go back inside if they sign the contract. I had heard on one podcast, it may have been with Michael Kaufman, who's a really good analyst. He was saying that someone in Chelyabinsk in Siberia could earn a lot more money being a delivery driver, delivering pizza or whatever, than he could earn in combat driving a truck. So monetarily, there's really mixed signals, so to speak. If you can get a better job, there's no point in doing it. In addressing your question of why it's kind of settled in, one of it's just I like to think of it is in August, September, October of World War I, there was a war maneuver, and then things started to settle down. It's kind of like that, in that both sides are oddly equal. They've reached a certain parity for all sorts of different reasons. One, the Ukrainians have fought much better. They're starting to get Western aid, and they've also had top-notch U.S. intelligence that's helped them tremendously. Yeah. And that the Russians fought poorly in the beginning, and now they're beginning to concentrate. That's why they had, I think, 5 axes of attack in the beginning, and now they're just doing the in the east. So they concentrated their forces, and still then they're barely moving. So it's they're really
and to build on what Mark's saying, I mean, their initial invasion is sort of one of the more absurd strategic invasions in sort of history, right? I mean, it wasn't just 5 sort of axes; it was 5 axes with about, I don't know, 40 thrusts. Which, if you sort of do the math between the territory that you were attempting to conquer and the amount of forces you would need, and then the density of that territory, meaning a city requires maybe 5 times, 10 times as many forces. So every time there's a little city, you need to have that much more. So if you did all that math together, the prior standard for absurdity of invasion was the U.S. invasion of Iraq, with about maybe at best 20% of the forces that were needed. You probably needed at least 750,000, probably closer to 1 million, 1.5 million. So probably 10% of what you needed. That was the prior standard for sort of ridiculous invasion that had no chance of success, given the size of what you were trying to, the whale you're trying to eat. This is a whole new world standard. The Russians would have needed likely at least 10 times, probably closer to 15 to 20 times, if you were attempting to have that many thrusts simultaneously, because you were basically looking to subsume. It was arguably the equivalent of the German blitzkrieg through Belgium and France in World War II that they were attempting.
Yeah, no, and I think you're highlighting of the Iraq War is really apropos here, because I think in both situations you have a country invading another country that it believes that the majority of citizens or a significant minority of the citizens will support the invasion as a
that's right,
and recreate a new government. So you don't need to eat the whale, because the whale will just flip on its back.
Exactly.
As soon as you rub its tummy enough. So
that's right.
I think in both the Iraq situation and the Ukraine situation, US and Russia respectively miscalculated the degree to which there would be internal resistance.
And I think this highlights something that isn't discussed at all right now, is that I believe there has been, and there is going to be building a substantial guerrilla territorial phase of this force for the Ukrainians. Number one, it's the cheapest way to get you there, right? So if you have two choices, building out full-blown mechanized infantry forces, armored corps, all of that capacity, I mean, that's quarters to years of time you need to build that, to build full combined arms, where you can literally sweep and take over the whole country again for Ukraine. Or plan B, you go to, your version of the Tikrit Sunni insurgency model, a la Ukraine, which we have to realize that until Zarqawi took over, or not even took over, until he became dominant in it, it was really not a religious insurgency at all. It was completely a political, social, regional insurgency. That's what it was, which is what made it so difficult, almost impossible to deal with, right? And I believe that is a model of insurgency on the cheap. And to be very honest, if there is one country that can advise the Ukrainians how to effectively do this, it's the United States, given the United States had to deal with it for 15 plus years. And so I think that is a very, very likely course that this can go in. It's a very cheap approach. And especially as there's potential for allies to get exhausted in this, and everyone to get exhausted in this and supporting it, and telethons and all the stuff. People want to get back to their lives, or Kardashians, or whatever else people want to do narcissistically in the world. I think that's a very high likelihood that this can shift into a pretty intensive guerrilla insurgency, which will mean this will start to look a lot like Syria.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of the guarantee of where this is going to go.
I was going to say that, considering what Iraq looked like and what Syria looked like when you had this kind of insurgency, which is a very unfocused insurgency, resulting in many civilian casualties, resulting in many cities becoming war-torn simply because the local security can't guarantee safety from these militant groups. I think that would be a very disastrous situation for Ukraine as well, right? Like it's not like this is something that Ukraine should choose blindly, as opposed to having a committed military like it has now. It has both pluses and minuses.
Because the big shift is your war psychology. When you go into this insurgency, your goal isn't winning; it's them losing, which is why this works pretty effectively. I mean, if you see these big insurgencies in history, whether it's the FARC in Colombia, whether it's the arguably ongoing Sunni insurgency, I don't think it's stopped in Iraq and in Syria. It's maybe has slowed down. It's more frozen conflict level, but and I believe that's why. To be honest, I think there's already minor forces that are doing that already in Ukraine, that are building, that you could almost argue are armed gangs that are going to just evolve. And the real risk for Ukraine is what almost always happens with this is you get a form of warlordism. It might not be Central Asian warlordism, but it'll be a lot closer to what you had in Iraq.
The partisans. It'd be similar to the partisans.
That's exactly.
Now, Mark, right. I wanted to add something as well.
Mainly, I wanted to agree with Aaron. I think this is. I've been thinking about this since day one, since February 24th. When are the Ukrainians going to start partisan warfare behind the lines? So far, I haven't seen any evidence of it. I haven't seen anything happen. They may simply be waiting for a longer kind of calming of it. And this partisan warfare will be one major way that Ukraine can put pressure on the Russians as this goes into a long-term conflict.
That's exactly right.
The Russians have a lot of ammunition, artillery ammunition and missiles, so they can lob a lot of munitions over on the lines and keep attritioning the Ukrainian forces. But that's going to be a bit of a balance act, and who can take it longer. And if you think about it, when the Americans were in Afghanistan and Iraq, there was a huge cultural gulf between the people they were fighting and the Americans. Here, the partisans know the Russians just as well as they know themselves. And especially in the East, they speak Russian. I mean,
it's a lot closer to the Colombian Civil War and FARC against the state, because of because they're Colombian. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, they're and maybe not the same. Maybe there's a difference between cosmopolitan and being more rural, etc., mountainous, whatever, nomadic. But ultimately, they can understand each other linguistically and culturally to the most part. To me, I think one of the biggest reasons that the Allies have to maintain a very intensive support of the Ukrainians is the leverage that the Allies have vis-a-vis Ukraine moving into a full-blown guerrilla partisan state, because the longer that we can quid pro quo the trade of large mechanized combined arms support and maintaining a professionalized military for the Ukrainians, and the slower they're likely to transition into that guerrilla partisan conflict, and we can maintain the penalty phase of the deterrence, right? We can in essence tell them, you're not going to get. I believe, to be honest, it's one of the reasons the West seems so slow, or I would almost not argue it's slow, calibrated, 2Zs, 4Zs, 8s, 12s, these small kind of incremental numbers, is that if we dumped 10,000 pieces of modern military equipment and tens of millions of units of support behind it, there's not much leverage left except for the training piece and the intelligence piece. Then Ukrainians' war optimism, having the equipment, was likely to lead to them thinking that they could do both guerrilla. And I do think there's a political control risk issue too in Ukraine.
All right, so let's, so this is sort of the question and answer period. So there were a few questions that I thought might be interesting to discuss. If you have additional questions you'd like to discuss, please put them in the chat. So one of the things that I think, especially as it ties into Aaron's series on the European Union security situation, is that on the 23rd of June, the European Union confirmed that Ukraine and Moldova have entered the candidacy stage for EU membership. Now, how does this affect the current conflict? What's the likelihood of Ukraine and Moldova becoming EU member states? How does this further entrench the Russian need to prevail in this war, at least from the Russian perspective?
It gives the Ukrainians hope, something to fight for. It gives the Russians something to fight, Putin at least something to fight for, because they cared most about Ukraine going into NATO. Putin really didn't want Ukraine becoming a member of the EU. He didn't like either one of them. But are they either going to become members in 10 years, 20 years, maybe? But both countries are very corrupt, very, very corrupt, and there would be a ton of progress that would have to be made in laws, in freedom of press, civil rights, anti-corruption, for them to be anywhere near becoming members.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges the EU has, and when I say EU, I mean Brussels versus the EU member states themselves, who are not necessarily fully aligned, both foreign policy-wise, obviously, but also in their orientation towards this conflict, is how much of this is a, let's call it, social signaling, right, to the modern world, where you can be impacted in a matter of hours to days by social opinion, and how much of this is a shift in policy. Because if it's a shift in policy, the commitment, this will be the largest commitment that the EU will have to deal with since really the original large-scale enlargement in the 90s. And at that point, you know, if we're honest, they were sort of making the rules up as they went along. I mean, you know, they were always codified in a treaty, but they would do it and then they would have a treaty behind it, right, after the fact. This is a little different, right, because you're already entering in a, you know, let's say reasonably stable union. And so they're going to have a new form of special dispensations for Ukraine, because the backup plan for Russia, you know, just like Ukraine can have a partisan war, is that the Russian backup plan will be to create a political proxy war, so destabilize Ukraine that at every, you know, one of the, I think it's 38 different conditions you have to meet to join EU, right? You know, it's all these changes you have to have in everything: environmental safety, laws, justice, you know, education. I mean, everything. That they can just build, you know, an FSB anti-EU ascension plan with a head of the director of each of those 38 and say, destabilize each of those. And then you have a political conflict around that, right? Where you're trying to create bribery, and then you popularize it and you promote that it happened, and you basically try to delegitimize the EU, the rules they have, or delegitimize Ukraine. And I think we have to assume the Russians will do that at full force, and that will require the EU to have countermeasures, not just legally, but politically, to understand that and to help the Ukrainians in this ascension process. This will be the most unique thing that ever has happened in the EU history, because you're going to have, in essence, a political civil war around EU ascension. Whereas normally you have to go through these processes yourself. You can hire out Brussels experts to help you, but basically you have to do the work. Right. This is going to be a, you know, not kinetic civil war, but a political, legal civil war on the ground in Ukraine that EU is going to have to actually put their, let's call it EU legal army, into Ukraine to help the Ukrainians, if this is going to work.
Yeah. Okay. So now one of the things that's just showed up in the news this morning and last night is that there are missiles being fired at Kiev from over the Belarusian border. Up to this point, Belarus has only been the staging ground for Russian military invasions. It's never actually been directly responsible for attacks on Ukraine, and of course now that's changed. And also Kiev, of course, we've talked about how Kiev has not been the site of battle for about 2 months now. How do these changes affect the war, and what can we see in terms of perhaps Belarus becoming part of the war? Is that not going to happen? Is Kiev again going to be a site, or is this a diversion? What's sort of your takes?
Do we know, first of all, whether these were Russian missiles or Belarusian missiles?
I believe that they're Russian, but I don't know if we know.
Okay.
I guess we've stumped the experts. All right. So recently, Putin and the Russian media have argued that unipolarity and American dominance in the world is sort of at an end, that the United States has to recognize that there's a Russian sphere of influence, that Russia is another party in the multipolar world. And again, also he has, rather the media mouthpieces in his name have argued that American prisoners in Russia should be exchanged for Russian prisoners in the United States, as sort of a quid pro quo type of situation. Do you have any comments about this? Is this a change in policy? Is this something that's notable? What makes this distinct against traditional diplomatic norms as well?
So actually, I have one quick answer to the one before. I had a problem with my mute there. Sorry. Which is the missiles coming in. I think that's the Russians testing some escalatory dynamics with the West to see if the West bites and redeploys any anti-missile capacity into the east, and or triggers the air defense support for the Ukrainians. Because I think the Russians are pretty aware that the West, the US especially, is holding back an enormous amount of support for the Ukraine, especially more advanced aspect, air defense, missile defense, offensive missile capability, airframes, aircraft, helos, UAVs, etc. And I think the Russians are testing that. It's a very cheap way for them to test the Western resolve behind that, and especially within domestic politics, whether it's the UK, France, US, and Germany, right? I mean, all four places right now are not necessarily in the most stable domestic political alignment. That would be my nice way of putting it. And more importantly, aren't necessarily aligned. I mean, maybe they get to alignment every time there's a decision, but it takes them 30 days. And so the Russians on the cheap, a cost of a few $100,000, if that, can test that resolve each time. And so I think that's a lot of this. And they can do it by, I'm not suggesting there's morality to this, but they can do this in sort of, hardcore realpolitik, launching from Belarus, hitting Kiev, like you kind of kill 3, 4, 5 birds with one stone right there, right? Kiev is now becoming psychologically this idea of a protected city. It's a Jerusalem now, right? Or we're starting to build a consciousness like that, right? And they've done that too themselves. Obviously, that's been part of them trying to build that protectiveness behind it. And so the Russians can launch, from various places, tactical intercontinental ballistic missiles or cruise missiles, which are the low end classification behind them, and go after a major city like Kiev, and then see does it hit the news and go everywhere? Does it only hit 10% of the news? So they can test the whole resolve of the Western system for very, very low cost.
Now, one of the things that you brought up there, and I think it's something that the news media hasn't really explained very well, is that the Russians have not been able to concentrate air support on their own side, despite the fact that they have a significantly larger air force than anything the Ukrainians put together, and that they haven't been effective in bombing raids. Basically, the air is open. Why are Russians so incapable of putting this together, given their significantly larger air forces?
So, I mean, you basically have a dual air denial campaign at this point. So there's really air denial on both sides. And so I think it comes from a couple things. Number one, the back to the original war strategy the Russians had, where the assumption was these, 40 different thrusts, and they would have lots of close air support where needed. So they used a lot of fixed wing close air support platforms, Su-25s, which are sort of the equivalent of the A-10s in the West or in the United States. And those fly slow. They're basically air cannons. It's a flying tank. But when it comes to modern air defenses, it's like, shooting a little monster in Space Invaders, right? It's pretty easy. And so the whole orientation of what the Russian air campaign needed to be was wrong from the beginning. And when you're wrong on your air campaign, you don't turn in a dime, right? That's something that if you're lucky, it takes you 6 months. And if you're unlucky, it takes you a year or two. And on the Ukrainian side, they didn't have that much to begin with. Except one thing they did get is from the West, quite a bit of man-pad, shoulder-fired, and then, small station anti-air capability, which has been enough to degrade, to create the air denial environment. I argue that's a mistake in the West, that we have not been willing to shift the Ukrainian air, shift the Ukrainians into an air dominant position, because we could do that. It's something we can do. We could take all our legacy, because everybody in the West is upgrading all of their air capacity, like in every country, to new generation helicopters, new generation UAVs, new generation fixed wing, new generation everything. So that you have, 90% of what you have is the old stuff. So you could get the bottom third of the old stuff and set up, hundreds of training facilities and maintenance facilities, and, shuttle in tens of thousands of Ukrainians. And, over time, this isn't going to happen in a week, but over 3 and 6 months, it's like an assembly line. You would start take 20 helicopter, a battalion of ex-Marine Cobra attack helicopters would be coming off every month. Another 5 or 7 group in, or Mirages would be coming off the line, et cetera. A bunch of UAVs we could bring online very quickly. We could be bringing probably 5 attack UAVs a week. I mean, fully crewed, Ukrainian crewed, if we wanted to, and that would be a big deal, actually. I don't understand why we're not doing that one. I believe politically that is a failure. Actually, the UAV one is a very in our consciousness still. It's considered sort of a very low level grade. Seeing jets, bombers, we feel that might be too escalatory, but UAVs don't feel escalatory, primarily because people can buy them at, Best Buy or at,
and there's no pilot to
around
lose.
the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. It feels more like a toy, even though it's not a toy.
Now to sort of shift gears a little bit, in 1994, Russia attacked Estonia with an incredibly powerful virus, nearly shutting down the entire Estonian internet.
Yep.
And Russia has been at the forefront of internet work with social media. We've talked about, we've seen, for example, Russia's influence in the 2016 elections. So Russia has historically been at the forefront of internet technology and similar developments. But if we look at the way that Russia's been conducting this war, it's been one of the most technologically backward military situations. We've had Russians calling on cell phones, to their commanders, no scrambled radio, losing communications repeatedly. Why is the Russian military so far behind where the Russian technological position is on other issues?
Corruption, training, focus on force effectiveness and command leadership. I mean, it's the old school basics, right? I mean, there's no shortcut for this stuff. I mean, people think there are, and if you're lucky, I don't mean morally, I mean, when you decide to conduct state policy, if you overwhelm a place and they fold, then you can feel effective. And I think that overconfidence, that war optimism that the Russians have had, has completely led them to walk into this because, before this war, they put, several thousand of the same airborne forces into Kazakhstan and turned a little dial to their favor and to the regime they wanted to support. And then, like you said, they've been conducting operations in whether Moldova, Estonia, Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia. I mean, probably at least 50 to 75% of the former Soviet Union in the last 20 years. And I think they believe they could just turn the dial up when it came to this conflict, which is why they launched that 40 thrusts, 5 axes attack, because they thought they could just show up and it would work. And they didn't plan for a conflict, I believe, past 2 weeks. And so if anyone that would have planned for a conflict past 2 weeks would clearly, logistically, but also fundamentally at a communications level. But to do that, you have to train. And to do that training, you are setting a signature, right? I mean, ultimately, I think what the Russians did, and I think we need to sort of, we're a little too oversimplistic. The Russians are dumb. The Russians don't know what they're doing, et cetera. The Russians made a choice, which is they chose surprise over preparation. And that was a wrong choice. Yeah. Because when you do prepare at scale, you leave an enormous signature. And that obviously you're trading time for that, because then the other force has the ability to try to defend itself and it prepare itself. So
now there's a comment that we have that additionally, like most dictators in history, Putin has indulged his weakness for yes men in military leadership, and therefore not really promoted those who necessarily have the skill. Now, Ralph, you wanted to add something quickly.
Okay, thanks. Going back to the question of the recent attacks from Belarus, the reports I've seen said that these are clearly Russian Russian aircraft firing long-range missiles from Belarus. And this is what Russia has been doing. They stand, because they don't have air superiority, they use their airborne missiles from a long range. Yep. And I guess airborne missiles are much less susceptible to counterattack than ground-launched missiles.
That's
so
exactly
this is, right. And they've also done the same thing from the east, from far to the east. So this is not really an escalation. It's just a continuation of Russia using air-launched missiles to attack targets at some distance. Thanks.
I mean, I think it's escalatory primarily because of what their launching platforms are, which are the Tupolev 160s, right? So the Tupolev 160s. So right now, people don't realize this, but behind the scenes, it's always going on. There's T-160, bombers that are flying around the NORAD circle. There always are, and in the U.S., NATO, and Canada, and the U.S., put up countermeasures, and so the more areas that there's 160s flying, there's more countermeasures that have to be brought up. I mean, that is this sort of force on force that's going on behind the scenes that I don't think is reported at all, really, and that is the Russian version, or is the Russian B-52, are the T-160 bombers and the newer generations. And
Bear.
I'm sorry?
The Bear, right?
Yep, that's right. And they have enormous capacity. I mean, these are in some ways almost super B-52s. And just like the B-52s, they have the ability to launch the Russian version of the cruise missiles. It's the same thing. It's literally a like for like. And what I would love to see, and I haven't seen anywhere, and maybe we won't, is to see where the different missiles have been launched from the T-160s. So if you can see that map, the West is going to have to put up countermeasures, because what we have to recognize, right? This isn't kids' hour, right? This isn't playing in the sandbox. That if a Russian T-160 is armed with cruise missiles, you don't know if they're nuclear, you don't know if they're not, and you have to go up and face them. And even though they might decide to turn and then fire on a trajectory towards Ukraine, that is putting pressure on the complete Western Alliance's air defense system, soup to nuts, right? And that's a cheap, once again, another cheap cost that on the Russian side that they can generate, $100 million a day or more in Western cost. And the key to this is exacting, right? There's an exhaustion, right? You see this with Taiwan and China, right? You start exhausting your forces, right? Because going up, doing air contestation missions around the clock, every hour a plane goes up, it's 20, 30 hours of maintenance. Right. It's, you can only do 12 hours on, 12 hours off so many times with pilots for so many weeks. They have to go and rotate. I mean, so it starts driving up the inner costs of the West's air contestation and air defense to a pretty, I argue, you do this long enough, 6 months or a year, it becomes pretty expensive.
So as I was asking earlier, so we talked about Putin and the Russian media going against this idea of unipolarity and using American prisoners as negotiating pieces. Is there sort of a response, a sort of thought on, is this something new from Putin? Is this a sort of a codification of older doctrines? What is sort of the thought here?
Mongol doctrine?
I'm a Mongol, hear me roar.
Well, no, I mean, you look at the use of hostages, right? The use of, I mean, this is not novel, right? It's novel because we're not used to modern statecraft codifying the use of large-scale use of hostages in statecraft terms as negotiating ploy pieces, right? So you could argue the Russians have taken, who knows what the number is, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens. I'm sure some of which wanted to go to Russia, but probably not all of them. And then there's probably hundreds of foreign fighters or people who they've been able to capture. And these are pressure points in the West. And obviously they have tens of thousands of Ukrainians probably that have been fighting, POWs. So they can construct this great big, hostage wall and make that a key part of their negotiation toolbox at a later date. And they can arbitrarily decide 20, 50-year prison sentences, executions, non-executions, blah, 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 like treason, high treason, low treason, whatever. They can just play with a dial and play against the Western sensibilities. I mean, you have a fairly well-renowned American, Brittany Griner, who's one of the great female basketball players in history, who's being held, and charged for possession of basically concentrate marijuana. And, she's somewhere between the judicial system and the political hostage system. And, what's the trade, right? Is the trade Victor Blunt, arms dealer? Is the trade a spy? Is the trade, and which is a proportional trade, right? I think the Russians are smart enough about this when it comes to these onesie twosies. They're going to trade them for parallel figures, right? They're not going to trade them for battlefield or large-scale state conditionality because they know the Ukrainians won't.
But is there going to be no pushback on the international scene for this sort of reversion to hostage tactics?
Norms?
Yeah.
I mean, look, the Russians have an escalatory ladder like they do with everything. That break most norms. If the Russians want to run out and start bagging and tagging tens of thousands of people from the West that are floating all over the world, they could do that. That could be, the largest modern hostage taking operation in history, and just basically scare the bedevil out of everybody. That was my grandmother's version of a curse word, and that no one's here has heard that one in 50 years probably. But but that's, and in some ways they're signaling, hey, we have other methods here, and I don't think we have a great response. Our response is, here's some more sanctions, here's some more laws. I mean, we basically have, in the West, we have two responses right now. We have legal and sanctions, and we have arming and training of the Ukrainians. That's it. Like, that's basically the whole show. Everything else is, off the table. And the Russians know this, obviously, so they can construct these extremely awkward extreme anti-norm behaviors that give them a huge advantage on the chessboard, because they can manipulate the social and political responses in the West when it comes to this.
Now, yeah, no, that that's yeah. So one of the things that
Good stuff, huh?
Yeah, no, but no, I think we covered it, right? So
Yeah.
one of the other things that we've sort of seen is that the Russians have taken control of that nuclear plant in Zaporizhia, which, as we pointed out, is one of the largest nuclear plants in Europe, if not the largest.
It's one of the largest in the world. It has 5 reactors. It's a pretty substantial plant.
Yeah. So the IAEA has heard accounts that Ukrainian workers there have been abused, and they are worried about the safety and security situation at the Zaporizhia nuclear facility. So what are some implications of that? And do we think that there's any problem that's going to arise as a result of the Russian occupation?
I mean, they're being held hostage to manage the nuclear plant. Let's just be honest. That's what's happening. And I think that's what we have to confront, basically. That's what the IAEA has to confront, the UN, the US, the West, et cetera. And objectively, if there's a space for some negotiation right now, what we should focus on is a nuclear carve-out in Ukraine, right? Like that's one that I think would be pretty smart for all parties. But the Russians, I think, don't have a lot of incentive, right? I mean, one of the things that's pretty clear now through this is that the definition of Russian incentives that we believed that from a deterrence perspective that the West had was wrong. So in the West, we were completely wrong in evaluation of the incentives, the whole incentive system, from a deterrence perspective. And and we don't have a new answer for that. And everybody's hiding in the sort of IR, intelligence, military community, because the answers are ugly, right? The answers are a substantial escalation in the Far East, Baltic, Nordic region to see if that triggers Russian incentives, meaning the Russians have to redeploy forces to the northern military district, which will then take pressure off of the southern district in Ukraine. We don't in the West want to trigger that escalation right now.
Right. So now I have 3 other questions here, but I think what might actually be more interesting is going to the slides that you have prepared, Aaron, about the war. But I had one other question before I did that, and that is, had the Russians, because the Russians previously were making advances past Kherson along the southwestern coast of Ukraine, right? Mikhailov, and they were sending missiles even into Odessa. So you have this long range attack moving across the southwestern border of Ukraine. That seems to have been repelled effectively by the Ukrainians so far. Do you believe that it's a Russian intention to maintain Kherson as like the westernmost area under Russian control, or do you think the Russians are going to continue to try to spread throughout the southwest?
I think they're going to try to spread. They're going to try to probe in the southwest. The Russians have no capacity to take Odessa if the Ukrainians don't want them to, right? And I believe Odessa is a red line for the Ukrainians. I think the Ukrainians will pour the kitchen sink into Odessa and turn it into a baby Stalingrad. And I think the Russians know that. And the Russians just don't have the infantry. I mean, the bottom line in this, the reason we're stuck is the Russians don't have infantry, and you can't make infantry, right? You can't outsource the infantry manufacturing to a Foxconn plant in China and infantry comes out, right? And it's a new iPhone, right? It doesn't work like that. So you're stuck when it comes to any city that Ukrainians actually want to defend.
So one of the questions that sort of comes to me when we mentioned the dearth of infantry on the Russian side is this seems, again, similar to technology, something where Russia has historically been very good in the sense of Russia has been able to throw how many humans into the meat grinder. Look at World War II, look at the Afghanistan conflict in 79. Russia has historically just thrown infantry repeatedly into a situation until victory results or the enemy literally can't see over the corpses. So why is Russia not able to field infantry in this conflict?
Well, because it requires mass mobilization. And Russia has typically had the ability to trigger mass mobilization. And the Russians are doing this slow head fake mass mobilization, which is just delaying it. I think what the Russians are doing, so we have to realize is the Russians have a two-tier system. There's a conscript system, you're a one-year contract. They have about 134,500. So about 135,000 every year cycling, and it takes 5 to 7 months of training, which has been cut down to maybe 2 months now. But that doesn't mean in 2 months you're ready. It just means they've cut the training down to 2 months. If anything, the Russians are doing this incorrectly. What they should do is train for 9, 10 months and put someone in for 60, 90-day rotation. They're going to be far more effective. But what the Russians are doing is training maybe 45, 60 days and then throwing them to the front or getting them nearer to the front and filtering people and adding training until they get to some front line, which then collides with a fixed defense, fortification, attrition, right? So it's World War I like in the way training. The Russians have fallen back to a World War I style of effectiveness, and I think what the Russians are trying to do, or Putin and the political system, is see what the gains they can get in this year's cycle. So there's a sub-cycle. It's almost like graduating classes in colleges. There's a sub-cycle that can be kicked off in like October, where you can do a small conscript, 40, 60,000. And I think the Russians are seeing how far they can get until that point. And if they can't get to where they want to get to, I believe they'll trigger a mass mobilization at some point. Now, that will be more politically significant than it is militarily. That will take a year for it to be effective at scale. But to be honest, it will only be effective if the Russians change their training doctrine.
Right.
They don't build effective fighting forces, which requires training, right? It's like anything in life. There's no shortcut. You want to be a chef, you can't take 3 days of cooking courses and be a chef. You need training.
So Mark, you wanted to add something as well.
Yeah, that it goes. Why the Russians haven't done the typical Russian thing of throwing troops is it goes to why Putin is so adamant about not calling this a war, that it's still a special operation. And from what I've read, that even though Russia is very much a dictatorship, it's a dictatorship with rules.
Yep.
And so that he has more freedom militarily to do what he wants, as long as it's not a war. But once he says, okay, now it's full mobilization, then it becomes a war. And then there are a lot of rules that there are more impositions. And it's an admission of defeat as well. And to your previous question about the Russians going to the southwest, and Aaron was saying, that's not possible. I would agree, but I think it's what he wanted to do. And if you look back at that map with the 2 Ukrainian presidents, that was orange in the upper left and then blue, that blue is in the east and it goes all the way to Odessa, all the way to Transnistria. That is what conceivably what's right there. What's in blue is what I think Putin would like to grab territorially if he can't control all of Ukraine.
Absolutely. Now, Ralph,
because this is about in the South. I think we have to realize is the war aims in the South are different than the war aims in the East and the North and left bank Ukraine. The war aims in the South are about turning the Black Sea into a Russian lake, and that's a completely different, basically geostrategic dimension than a Ukrainian limited war that's about the territorial integrity of Ukraine. However important that is, the Black Sea represents a radically different configuration of Russian power.
So while we have the Black Sea up, we actually have a question in the comments says,
and Ralph has his hand up too.
I know, I'm going to get there.
Okay.
I believe that the remaining Ukrainian ports have also been pretty effectively blockaded, though. Doesn't that bring other urgent pressures?
Well, yeah. I mean, you have, basically, and Ralph can, I'm sure, really go into this too, is that the amount of grain that can be shipped overland through trains is minuscule compared to what can be shipped via traditional large-scale, grain shipping. And this is a Russian. Think of this as instead of human hostages directly, this is them having trade grain hostages, right? So the Russians, once again, I wasn't kidding when I said Mongol earlier, right? Like, the Mongol playbook on hostage taking, when you really study it, is the most sophisticated in human history. I mean, they built a doctrine. It wasn't just a bunch of gangs sort of grabbing anyone they could and trying to squeeze them for 3 gold ducats, right? This was the Mongols built a stratagem around it. And I think the Russians are building their own modern version of this, which they can create an enormous amount of pressure points in their negotiations. Basically.
Now, Ralph, you wanted to mention something.
Okay, thanks. This was compared with World War II and Afghanistan. Now, of course, in World War II, the Russians were prepared to do an astonishing mass mobilization and really mobilize to defeat Germany. The Ukraine is closer to Afghanistan than it is to that when Russia was being invaded and attacked. Yep. You mentioned Afghanistan, that they were willing to pour stuff into Afghanistan, except ultimately they weren't. Ultimately, they lost Afghanistan. Right. They suffered, eventually they started suffering enough deaths. Again, they assumed it was going to be a fairly easy victory. They suffered enough deaths, and eventually enough people started asking why. Why are Russians dying for Afghanistan? And I think now Ukraine is, of course, closer to Russia, but nonetheless, Putin doesn't want this to be another Afghanistan. The loss in Afghanistan destabilized the Soviet Union. It played a significant role in the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and of course Putin is desperately afraid of that. He thought this would be a quick and easy victory, and so gaining Ukraine for modest losses would be very popular with the Russian nationalists, and one should certainly not underestimate Russian nationalism. But when more and more people are dying for minimal gains, and gains that are not clear to most Russians, then there's the risk of loss of the authority. I think I agree entirely with Mark. Loss of authority by Putin and his allies. Thanks.
Absolutely. Now, Aaron, would you like to discuss a little bit about this slide?
Yeah, sure. And I actually one piece I think that's really important here that I think Ralph brings up is, the impact of losing Russian forces in Afghanistan was quite substantial. And I would argue, generally speaking, for great powers and war optimism and optional wars, that the center of gravity, the concept that the source of power that provides the moral or physical strength or the freedom of action or the will to act, right? That's a theory and a construct developed by Karl von Clausewitz, a great Prussian, eventual general. He was a colonel when he came up with this, and that the center of gravity of Russia in this war, I argue, is dead Russians forces. And I think the West knows this, but we're quite uncomfortable with this because the kinetic action, because of the modern social structure that we have now through social media, through seeing, bad things, is such that we feel very uncomfortable participating to drive those numbers to the levels that it would require to change the course of action in Russia.
So basically, we don't want to just run on a shooting spree, killing a bunch of Russians.
Yeah, that's the simple answer. And you know, and we don't mind if the Ukrainians do this really slowly, you know, kind of behind the scenes. Like, we don't want to see how the sausage is being made, basically. But we don't want, because to create the velocity to do this, right, the speed, the West would have to become a much more impactful participant in this, and much more directed, you know. So which we are clearly pretty active in our support intelligence wise. But if you use advanced intelligence like we are, but you are giving the Ukrainians the equivalent of slingshots, well, you'll have fantastic visual intelligence, but you can't really act on most of it, right? And so aligning those two, if the West did that, then I think over time, change the center of gravity for this. But that's something the West has been unwilling to do. And to me, that's sort of a big test in this. And especially after the first phase of the conflict, where the Russians had enormous losses. I mean, likely minimum tens of thousands when you count POWs and you know, forces that you know, that quit and ran away, and wounded. I mean, it was probably 25, 50,000 at least. It is a very big number in a very short period of time. The Russians have shifted. Clearly, they don't have anywhere near those level of losses, and they've clearly shifted to a model where they could sustain whatever losses they have so far. And if they can just kind of ground out of a frozen war, more of an attrition one that they control, they probably feel they can handle that politically, which means that's the center of gravity. That if the Ukrainians and the West decided, well, we're going to change that equation, then that forces the Russians to have to escalate or to change or de-escalate or to change what they're doing.
All right. So what's going on here?
Yeah. So we spoke earlier about this is now mostly a battle of tier 2 and tier 3 units, and those units over time that survive will gain competence, but they'll gain competence in basically area defense. They won't gain competence in being mobile maneuver units. And this is really the fundamental problem, is that they won't have developed the more advanced logistical intelligence communications capabilities that you need when you put combined arms and maneuver warfare together, right? So they'll become really good. So you're in essence reconstituting the 2014 to 2022, early 2022, Luhansk and Donbass type Azov battalion type forces with these tier 2, tier 3 units. And right now we're in this era, it's just all low gains. The proof that this is happening is that whenever there's a little breakthrough, the Russians can't capitalize on it. They don't have the maneuver capability to do it, right? They go 5 clicks, 10 clicks, they stop, and then they have to reconstitute their forces. You know, it's a battle of lower trained forces, which, you know, turns much more into, you know, you could say this will generate a guerrilla war by default if you do this long enough, because that's the training that people will have, basically.
Now, one of the things that's sort of been noticed on the international economic system is, right, we talked 1 or 2 meetings ago about how Russia was removed from the SWIFT system. Now, the G7 have already stopped buying Russian gold, or at least they've said they will. So with Russia having so many sanctions, is there anywhere else on that sanctions escalation ladder to go? Russia, for example, was unable to pay its debts, not because it doesn't have the funds, but because it literally has no mechanism to pay them.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'll be honest, I think what's left to sanction on the Russian side Europe's making or attempting to make a transition away from all the Russian energy, which will probably take this year and next year, regardless of what they say, just because you have to find the supplemental capacity, right? You're not just turn off the gas in December. No one's going to do that. Nobody's that dumb. I mean, people are dumb, but they're not that dumb. And so, but at the end of the day, what you're doing is constraining supply, which is driving prices up, right? And so the Russians are maybe generating half of the volume, but the price is up 3x or 2.5x. So, they're getting the same income. To me, I think the problem with the sanctions regime you have right now, and it's the same problem we have with everything else. We don't want to sanction at the second, you understand this legally, the second and third tier states, right? Which are states like India, states like China, states like others, because we view that as a political diplomatic escalation of the war, right? So at the end of the day, we're attempting to basically contain this within Europe, in the sanctions regime, and Ukraine on the battlefield, right? So think of our approach in the West is basically try to draw a circle, keep this thing as tightly wound around Europe in the political dimension and around Ukraine in the fighting dimension. And I believe that is our center of gravity, is basically that, and the Russians know that. And so the Russians can put pressure points by cutting side deals with, Israel, South Africa, Brazil. The concept of the new BRICS has come out in the last week. Let's have a whole new set of BRICS, basically an anti-Western BRICS, which is just a set of pressure points, because they know we're not going to sanction the rest of the BRICS when they do business with the Russians. Yeah. And, so the way I think this is impacting Russia is everything in Russia is going into slow motion. Most things aren't shut off completely, but they're going into slow motion. So in the past, if Russians were buying, if they had monthly demand for, I'm making up, 10,000 fancy, Gucci bags, those 10,000 now get spread out over a year, right? So, which drives up the price, maybe 2x for a while, but then it starts to normalize. Maybe it's up 20%, 30% permanently.
Now, here on this slide, you mentioned that with the Ukraine counteroffensive, that there's no force availability. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, so you have to think of your first tier forces in a state as your capable forces that can do things. When I say do things, that can move and actually do something on the battlefield.
Achieve mission
objectives. And when you leave that group, the only subgroup is within the second tier forces that used to be first tier forces. But typically, unless you break them out of the second tier and maybe make them a baby first tier, they're stuck in the concept of the last, the weakest link in the chain kind of theory, right? So that X first tier that's in the second tier is spending all their time, if you've ever tutored people or worked with people at work that aren't as capable as they need to be, then you spend an enormous amount of your energy doing their work, or trying to at least get them to do their work. And you just have a little bit of time to do your work or your advancement. Well, there's no difference here, right? And then when you go below that, these are arguably, local territorial forces that can, hopefully just not shoot each other or neighbors with random, fire. They're not forces that, these are forces that would need substantial training, 6 months realistically. So
tell me a little bit about Vadim Savitsky and what's going on here.
Yeah. So there is a substantial problem in the Ukrainian intelligence overall. Their main intelligence directive, their sort of state security, where there's a bunch of conflicts between them. One of which is more professionalized, more military oriented. That's the GUR, and then they have another their state security, which is sort of being blamed for losing Kherson and not blowing the bridges there, and having people sort of run out, quit, hide, leave with buckets of money, go to Russia, whatever. So they just wanted to lay that out there, right? So this is an analysis that they put out in terms. So there's a very interesting marketing, let's say, at this point, propaganda, whatever you want to call it, communication strategy that the Ukrainians are doing. So in the beginning, when the Ukrainians were, I think surprising everybody, there was a lot of chest thumping and, Ukraine can do it. And now as we're grinding on to month, 5 and so on, where this is now a long war, which was always my belief this was going to be a long war, because no one had the force to actually win, and neither side wanted to quit, and they both had a will to fight. So if that's the case, then you get a long war. I mean, I think it's pretty simple physics, unless an outside party comes in that can overwhelm both sides, which is impossible. So, so now we're in this phase with the Ukrainians, where the Ukrainians are at it's the end of days, right? We're 1 week away, it's all over, which is I call it the begging phase, which is the guilt phase to the West. You need to do more. You need to do everything. Which is a continuation. So at this point, they're suggesting that the Russians have over 100 battalion tactical groups, and that Russian capabilities are able to increase this maybe by 50% in this next mobilization, which I believe is sort of true by the fall. But we're also talking about effectiveness. I mean, the problem ultimately is these BTGs are not what you think battalions are, right? So they're not infantry battalions. These are sort of little micro armies that have everything from medical to communications to warfighters to you name it. The problem is out of maybe 800 to 1,000 people that they originally were supposed to be staffed up to, they're now probably down to 500 to 600 maybe. And the amount of actual combat infantry, real infantry, is maybe 50 people, 100 max. They're not. There's none of these BTGs with 200 infantry and 500 total. It doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't have a BTG anymore, right? So, so the Russians have such a limited amount of infantry. And by the way, you're not throwing cooks in for 2 reasons. They can't do it. Number 2, who's feeding people? Right. So, it's like you're taking someone out of a job to go fight, right? It doesn't work like that, because that job is needed. So these small units this is one of the reasons these breakthroughs don't work, is they don't have anyone who can maintain the breakthrough, right? They have enough to get the breakthrough and stop. And then they have to establish a new area defense, and then rinse and repeat. And that might take another month or 3 weeks. And then, but you're getting 5 kilometers at a time. And we're assuming that the Ukrainians don't have any counteroffensives with the same type of forces, right? And then that starts to push them back. And so this is why you have this ebb and flow going on. And so, I mean, he makes it pretty clear, which I think everybody knows from the beginning, that the goal is to completely control Donbass. And then the whole, Kherson Oblast, and he suggests it's done by the fall, and then build this quasi-state people's republics. That's the political dimension. I think ultimately the Russians in the next year are trying to have left bank Ukraine, and they could, but if the Ukrainians prepare themselves in that next year, they could have a massive counteroffensive, and Russia would lose, 75% of it, and we go back to these lines. I believe, as a betting person, there's a 50-50 shot, whether this lasts 6 months or 4 years, we get back to the original lines in the end, because those lines had the the requisite logistical support that the Russians need, train system, and the Russians can't fight out in the open. And when you leave that, you're out in the open. And the Ukrainians are going to be building over time more mobile maneuver mechanized infantry. It might take another year, 6 months, but they're going to do it. And if, as they do it, they're going to counterattack.
Ralph, you have your hand up?
Yeah, there have been a couple of comments on sort of the impact of this on the global scale and the idea of an anti-Western BRICS. I think this is a little misleading. China, of course, is, I think, reasonably anti-Western. India and Brazil, rather less so. I followed some of the UN votes on some of the anti-Russian resolutions, and the large majority of the African countries abstained. And I guess a lot of people here said, well, what do you mean? If they're not in support of us, they must be against us. This must be a pro-Russian vote. Well, no, I don't think so. From an African point of view, and probably from other areas, they see this as a European conflict. This is Russia versus the West, and they don't really want to take a side in that. This is your fight. This is not ours. They're not all that concerned about Ukraine as such. This is primarily the East versus the West. And of course, they have traditionally, sometimes one of their names has been the non-aligned movement. They're not going to take a fight. Now, I think a lot of people, fair number of people recognize that our support for Ukraine and our great concern about the Ukrainian people and their well-being has an element of sort of ethnocentrism to it. That is, we care about the Ukrainian people in a way we didn't really care about the Iraqi people or the Afghan people or the Vietnamese people. And so from this just sort of emphasized the fact that from an African, Asian, Latin American point of view, this is a European fight that's not their involvement. Furthermore, for the African countries, the West are their colonizers, their former colonial masters, which many of them still recognize. When I lived for several years in French West Africa, there was quite a bit of anti-French nationalist feelings, and in the British colonies, so on. In India, a lot of people have a long, lingering resentment against the British. So supporting the West has an element of supporting their old colonial masters in their attempt to dominate, well, in this case, Europe, but so I think these other countries, this is not their fight. We say, well, why aren't they concerned about it? Russia is clearly an international war criminal. Well, they don't see it in these principal things. They see it as just, this is a European battle and they're not going to take sides. Thanks.
Yeah. No, and I agree with Ralph's sort of macro interpretation of that. I think where this gets challenging is in the micro, which is in the modern world, the ability for Russia through agent proxies, it's like a principal agent problem, right? They can come out and have third, fourth, fifth parties basically break sanctions regimes, directly and indirectly, and use, dozens of states that once again are non-aligned. They don't have a dog in the fight, but those states still, let's say, don't fully comply or don't comply at all with the sanction regimes, which then puts pressure on the West to either enforce the sanction regimes against those states. And then the Russians could say, see, they're your old colonial masters. They don't care about you. So it's a point of friction here. And the Russians, I think, and the Chinese, I think, will be very smart about leveraging that. And I think that's a fundamental challenge. And so what happens is we're in this sort of lose. Yes, the West did all these bad things for, a millennia. But today, Russia's doing X and Y, and you can't get food because Russia's doing X and Y. but then the Russians, or grains, etc., seeds, whatever, fertilizer. But then the Russians, through their non-Western aligned, propaganda, can say, well, this is all invented by the West. And so there's this lose-lose-lose proposition, which I believe the only way around this is the West has to be willing to do things to support those states, right? So if a state can't get its grain that it would normally get, the Western states need to be willing to step in and take its harvest or its capacity and start using it as much as it can, even if it only get them 50% of what they normally get, because then it's a proof point. It's real. It's not just talk. It's not PowerPoint. It's not UN meetings. It's real.
I've got two comments that I sort of want to put out there. The first one is that when we have a long war, as it's increasingly becoming, we are going to have worldwide food supply shortages because of Ukraine's role in the food economy that, Aaron, you discussed at length in our May 8th presentation. You're going to have diplomatic alliance crisis and increased potentials for expanding into a global conflict the longer this draws out. And the second comment that I wanted to sort of bring up is that we've discussed how Africa is not aligned, but we also should be very clear that there's an official Russian presence and there has been a Soviet history in Africa against the colonizers. So that might, and things today like the Wagner Group, that lead to a more pro-Russian position in Africa than simply a non-aligned perspective might suggest. So now that I've brought up this map, this is a map of the BTGs that Aaron was talking about, those battle tactical groups, and you can see how the Russians are concentrated around the city of Kramatorsk in a much greater degree and along on the west bank, or as is typically said, the right bank of the Dnieper River, in order to defend the city of Kherson and the mouth of the Dnieper. If you want to sort of, Aaron, go through a little bit about what we're seeing when you look at these BTGs.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the concentration of forces. So the Russians have learned in the last 4 months. And what they're doing is they are, in essence, with the forces they have available, right? Because this is all you have to work with, all they have to work with. They're densifying or trying to collapse a battle space into a smaller set of areas, which if you look, directly in the center of the map, you can see that's their concentration. And their goal there is an encirclement. And I believe their goal there is a breakthrough where they can get to, Dnipro. That's going to be a test. Can they do that, hold their logistical lines? Because what they are going to be exposed to, if the Ukrainians can build this capacity, is a left flank envelopment over time, right? And that's why you see that larger force up on top, right, by Kharkiv or north of Kharkiv, is and I argue that if the Ukrainians wanted to really test this, they should be sending decent sized reconnaissance probes north of the Kharkiv region, because that would start to stretch those forces out. And then you see those forces that are in the rear, in the far north. Those are, reconstituting forces, training forces, and a reaction force for probably that. But then at that point, you're pulling everything into the fight. And I think the clear thing that we have to understand about the Russians, even to this day, they don't have a unified command. So the Russians are down to 3 commanders-ish. So that's great. That's a big improvement from, 50,000 that they had at the beginning of the campaign, or, probably 12. I think it literally was 12. So they're slowly building and a lot of this just comes down to how they're structured in their forces between the Eastern Military District, the Western, the Northern, the Southern District. And so when forces come from those districts, they bring those commanders into the battle. The Russians have not developed a modern Western orientation to a unified command. And they still haven't done it at this point. So I argue you could stretch that the center of gravity around their weakness in command, and by stretching them out, you would force multiple commanders to be fighting for the same resources. But at this point, I think the Russians are looking, and I think they will complete their encirclement. It'll probably take another month-ish, and then let's see how exhausted they are. If they can launch and complete a fight into Dnipro and hold it, well, then that's a substantial shift in the battle space. If they can't do it, that'll prove that their forces are completely exhausted. And then you settle into these new sort of fixed defense spaces, which is the long war. So following the sort of day-to-day fight, I think, is less relevant. And I know that's what Twitter does, and that's what is easy to do, and that's what BBC or Sky or NBC or whatever. It's sort of understanding what's the concentration they have and what can they do with that concentration. Because if you go back to the prior map, real quick there, Richard, I mean, that concentration they have is enormous. That's the better part of 50% of their forces. And if those 50% of the forces can only move 50 kilometers in 2 months, well, that is like the actual definition of exhaustion right there. I mean, you are an exhausted force, whether it's material, logistics, command, operations, the people, the quality of the effectiveness you have, everything. And so I think what the Ukrainians are doing right now is they're trying to generate as much cost on these Russian forces as they can. And they're taking huge costs also, right? I think the Ukrainians, between all forms of losses, are losing in the hundreds a day, whether it's POWs, killed, wounded, forces that get depleted otherwise. And the question is, can they afford to lose, equivalent of a battalion or two a week? The advantage is you're not losing a whole battalion at once, right? You're losing pieces of battalions. The question is, can you recompose what you lose? So to me, this is going to be the interesting thing. Do the Ukrainians not do what the Russians do? So the Russians have allowed degraded battalions to just get weaker. And what the Russians needed to have been doing, and I believe they are starting to do that now, but this command friction is a problem for them to do this, is they're starting to combine weaker battalions to actually make a strong enough battalion. So this is the pocket that's going to get closed in the next few weeks to a month, to max.
Discuss a little bit about this map.
Yeah. So this is the Luhansk sort of salient right now, and the Russians have been fighting for a month-ish, 6 weeks here in this pocket with or salient with the Ukrainians, and this is as far as they can get. And so they've been able to push on the northern and the southern flanks, and their center thrust is the majority of where the Ukrainian forces smartly have been defending, and they have more of an area defense there and a mobile defense on the northern and southern side. And one thing that's an advantage that the Ukrainians have is the road network, right? So if you look, I think one of the more important things, as somebody who, if you want to really try to understand where this war can go, focus a lot more of your attention on roads, because the roads are really the key to this whole conflict when it comes to mobility. Obviously, it's the road, and you take mechanized forces there. But it also is a limiting factor, because it allows in between the roads for you to have a pretty dynamic mobile defense there. If you have light maneuver sort of scout forces, because you can take two large areas of roads, but if you don't take what's inside those two areas, and you need an enormous amount of infantry to do that, well, then you can have a little micro guerrilla war going on just between those two roads. And I think that's a lot of what the Ukrainians are preparing for. And it's a smart defense. The question is, can they cash for that? So this is extremely well organized Russian invasion that was highly unified in command and had very, very effective thrusts. That's a joke, obviously. So this is the Russians at every turn for months, basically doing probes, mini thrusts, and then creating a fixed defense wherever that is with a small unit, a battalion size unit or a company size unit in many cases. And this is, and I argue this is just, we're going to have a continuation of this fight like this for, probably the rest of the year until the Ukrainians can build enough density of forces. At this point, whoever, and the Russians, I just can't understand this, do not seem to want, either doctrine or politically in the military, to strip, cannibalize, and build composite forces that are larger, i.e. build divisions, corps that are real, that have, tens of thousands of forces and have, mechanized capability. And I think the big reason is, it's just almost the opposite of what the Ukrainians have. They don't want to give up territory to do that. So the moment you start stripping these forces, they got to pull out of all these little, I would argue, mostly pointless positions they're in, and you start to densify so that then you can have a much larger mobile maneuver campaign. So this is a much more medieval, old world, up to World War I. We don't want to give an inch kind of fighting. And that means you can't take more than an inch. And the question is, who's going to be politically adaptive enough to be willing to give up some territory and buy the time and space you need so that you can concentrate your forces and then launch a significant enough campaign. And if neither side does this, I mean, we'll do this for years.
All right, so I think if nobody has any further questions, I think we can close it out. Thank you all your panelists for taking your time and talking about everything here.
Yeah. Oh, there was a couple of questions that Patty had in there, or did you talk about? Oh, okay, yeah, the Wagner Group in Africa. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, what's very fascinating is to see how much the Russians leveraged what were their Cold War ties, which were the strongest in Africa of any large state, and effectively leverage military, political, diplomatic, economic activity in Africa, across Africa, I should say, and then how much the Chinese tag along in that effort, or the Russians and Chinese have some type of co-opetition with each other. That will be, fascinating. There was a bunch of talk a few months ago about a bunch of volunteers, rogues, etc., proxy forces. I mean, I think that's about as material as the international brigades that have been set up. I think that's mostly propaganda. I mean, not to say nobody came, but it's not meaningful on the battlefield at all, and it won't be.
We have one comment thanking us for being here, and yep. I think with that, another comment on strategy. Really thanking you, Aaron, for your expertise and your discussion about that. Sure. So
yeah, and one other quick thing, I'll put in the YouTube links of a lot of this material that I'm talking about, and I'll just keep updating from going forward between our sessions on Ukraine every month-ish. We're trying not to do this more than that because of, to be blunt, the slow changes, right? And not get caught up in all the tactical, daily sort of, events. But I'll try to put as much content in there over the next few weeks as it comes through. And then, so those of you that want to, get some additional content, points of view, we'll load it up into the YouTube channel, into the main or comment section.
Do our panelists want to say any last things before we go?
No.
All right, then have a nice weekend, and we'll see each other in our next sessions.
Yep. And by the way, do you have any events, Richard, you want to talk about that you're doing coming up this week?
Well, this Thursday, we have our session in our Middle Eastern History group on Persian constitutional reform. So that's the end of the Qajar dynasty, late 19th, early 20th century Persia. Following that, we're going to have our two sessions on the following Thursdays on World War I in the Ottoman Empire. First on military tactics and the second on the Armenian Genocide. And our up next European Union session will be in 2 Sundays from today. I think that sort of covers everything.
And the European, so in 2 Sundays from today, so we've had about half a dozen events that we've talked about the development of the European Union's foreign policy, defense, and security. And so we're bringing it into the 2010s now. And so, we'll start to, over time, sort of converge with what's going on with Ukraine. I mean, not completely, but we'll be bringing it in from an EU perspective. So those of you that are interested in how the EU, as it was constituted then, with the UK, and then eventually, post-Brexit, and how it deals with European security and defense. So, which ultimately is it's the primordial ooze that is part of this conflict, actually. So for those, go ahead, please.
I'm so sorry. Before you continue and go ahead, I apologize. Just want to add a couple more sessions that we have coming up, if anybody's interested. As Richard had mentioned, Persian Constitution. We also have next week at 12 p.m. Jane is going to present one of our series on Catherine the Great, which is a powerful women's series. And that would be at 12 p.m. on Saturday. And also, Jason is starting on the 11th of July, the Stoicism philosophy, which is going to be combined with history of, philosophy and Greek and Roman history of cynicism, Stoicism, and all that stuff. And also, me and Sergio will be actually having an exhibit on the life of a Roman soldier, which would involve me and him camping out and kind of showing the food and what people used to wear in those times as a soldier and where they used to go.
Full experience, right? Full experience.
Full experience, yes. Just kind of like bring that up to speed. If you want to see our schedule, obviously look at one of our groups, which is either History Most Ancient. We have other group that's called World History Enthusiasts. And then recently I've become me, Richard, becoming co-organizer on New York City Museum Food and Travel Group, which has about almost 10,000 members. And one other thing, I think for those of you that want to understand more Russian history, I think Jane's Catherine the Great will be really important because there's a lot of, iconography, what do you call it? How did you say that? Heliography? Yes, is that correct? Am I right? Yeah. That Putin and the regime has been attempting to leverage. A little Peter the Great. It's like a little gumbo. Peter the Great, Catherine the Great. A little touch of Brezhnev. Throw a little salt and seed of Alexander II. I mean, they're trying to sort of build a composition of Russian greatness 2.0. And so understanding a lot of that background, I think can guide when we hear speeches that Putin has been giving over the last, he had a huge speech for 75 minutes, which was it is a huge speech plus a 2-hour conversation with the president of Kazakhstan. It was sort of weird. I'll put that in the links.
because the president of Kazakhstan, who he bailed out in January, basically said, yeah, we're not going to participate in this Ukrainian thing. And he said that, and you generally don't see two leaders doing that, like in anything. I mean, next to each other, it was a little almost political behavior you saw in out of U.S. leaders in the past, and others. So it was a little, so I think there's some interesting, and Putin in that speech made an enormous amount of references to Catherine the Great and to the greater Russia and to the greatness of Russia and to, basically how to make Russia great again. I mean, you might as well have a, whatever that would be, Marga, sort of a Marga. Lastly, I know there's a question here that Michael had around guerrilla war, which I think we answered, but to me, this is it'll be the last thing I'll say here is I think the risk is this: if the Ukrainians can't reconstitute their tier 1 forces in the next 3 months, then it almost guarantees a degrading into a guerrilla war, because that'll really be all that the Ukrainians can do. They'll have it'll basically be a think of it as a two-dimensional fight they'll have. They'll have their fixed attrition forces to maintain positions and area defense, and then they'll have the guerrilla forces that'll be these smaller, lighter, less logistically intensive forces, and then they'll just get all the support they can get from the West, intelligence, drones, whatever they can grab, and then that'll be that, and then that will go on for eons. I think if that happens, this will not end. Because even if you want to end it, you're going to have to figure out how to shut your guerrilla forces down. And at a certain point, you build warlord regional commanders. And we all know how that ends everywhere in the world. There's no magical Ukrainian version of this. It's if you've got 25, 50 warlord colonels with their own territorial guerrilla forces, mafias, how are you going to get them to stop? You're not going to fight them all with what? The people maintaining your area defense, right? You're gonna have cops show up. I mean, go up against guerrilla forces. I mean, this is where it gets pretty real. So
I was going to say the way that you're describing Ukraine right now sounds like China during the nationalist period, where you have a lot of different warlords that Jiang Jisha or Chiang Kai-shek was trying to unite under one government.
Or Syria. I mean, what was Syria? I mean, we have a lot of social, political, cultural constructs, because there's ISIS commanders, there's Kurd commanders, there's pro-Iraqi Kurd commanders, there's anti-Turkish Kurd commanders, there's Christian command, on and on and on and on, right? You have dozens of these, and to this day, who's got an umbrella on all that? Nobody, right? You have great regional and great powers in there. You have the Turkey, new spelling version, Russia, US, Syria, Iraq a little bit, Iran, the West, let's say a little bit of NATO, France, etc., UK. And so, I think there's right now we're at about 25% risk that happens in Ukraine. And if the Ukrainians can't reconstitute a large, capable force in the next 3, maximum 6 months, then that percentage probably goes up to 50%. And once it goes over that, I mean, as the percentages go up, people are doing this, right? So it's not like I'm creating a fake equation here that says that 99% people start doing guerrilla war. They're already doing a little bit of this. It's almost like, I'll do my day job fighting, and then if I'm in a region that isn't very controlled by central command, I might do my own guerrilla fighting already, out of the command structure. And eventually those percentages just get larger and larger over time. That's how you get main force guerrilla war, right? That's effective because it's being done by people who are actually trained. It's not just, grandpa picking up a rifle, trying to take a pot shot out of a window. It's taking main forces, and they basically transition into guerrilla fighting. and they break down their unit integrities. And then they strip all the logistics, and then away you go. You can never put Humpty Dumpty back together.
I was going to say the big issue with guerrilla warfare, and it's sort of brought up by the comment that we see there, that possibly in modern fourth generational warfare that we should just devolve to guerrilla warfare. The problem is that without a unified national command structure, you don't have a unified national result.
That's right.
And so if you want to create nation states that are actually functional with viable borders, then you need to have unified command structures.
That's right. And because at the end of the day, you're ideally you're fighting for a reason, not just fighting for fighting, right? It's not, amateur MMA hour where people are just fighting to, release testosterone. It's actually, your goal is to achieve a political aim. And the more diffuse your forces are under a less effective centralized command, it doesn't give you the ability to joystick, to control, when you fight and when you don't fight, and the reasons that you fight. So if you allow that diffusion, you create thousands of reasons to fight, and human beings, when you give us enough reasons to fight, we'll keep fighting. And if Hatfield and McCoys, for those of you aware of American history, fought for better part of 100 years to a point that people had no idea why they were fighting. They were fighting because someone else fought them. And then pretty soon that just becomes its own life. And that's one of the reasons you don't want this to grade into, and I do believe the risk here in a guerrilla fight is a civil war. And nobody's talking about that. And the reason it's a big risk is the ability of the Russians to proxy. The Russians are world-class proxiers. They will find a way to proxy forces. They know how to do this probably as well as anybody. And Ukraine's becoming the world's largest arms depot. And you put world-class proxy, engineers, arms depot, training and fighting all in the same bucket, probably not what you want to do in life. And there's nobody on the outside that can change this. And by the way, long term, I believe Russian strategy, nobody's really saying this, but I think we all believe this, is that if Russia can't have Ukraine, then nobody has Ukraine, because we can destroy Ukraine. We turn Ukraine into Syria. We basically degrade Ukraine into the 1910s and force $1 trillion on cost on the West. I think that's at this point, that's probably a 40% chance. We're already there. They've already done that in the East. I mean, let's just be honest. The East is not habitable for modern life, and would require probably, tens of billions, if not, more, to completely redevelop it. And who wants to redevelop? Where's the investment coming to redevelop Luhansk and Donbass with the Russians being there as a proxy? Nobody. No one's going to put a dime into that. And so if the Russians can do that to left bank Ukraine, they've just extended that destruction, just like nobody's putting a dime into Syria. And it's taken the Iraqis 10 years to make the South investable to some degree. I mean, at least Gulf countries would be willing to put some money in, or Indians or whatever, Chinese. So, that I think is formal Russian strategy.
On that optimistic thought, let us adjourn, and we'll see each other soon on all those events that we've mentioned.
Thanks so much. Thanks,
Thank you, everybody.
Great job, Richard. Thank you.
Likewise.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph.
Bye.
Bye-bye.